When we look at Iran, not just through the lens of geopolitics or foreign policy, but through the lens of history, spirit, and identity, we begin to understand that what sustains its resistance is not simply a reaction to external forces, but something far deeper. It is the kind of resilience that doesn't begin in strategy rooms or manifest only in government policies. It begins in the heart. It begins in homes, in ancient stories, in mourning rituals, in poetry, and in collective memory. When a people choose to stand, not out of convenience, but out of conviction, that choice reshapes how they suffer, how they persevere, and how they define dignity. Iran's stand against isolation, war, sanctions, and pressure is not rooted in a hunger for conflict, but in a refusal to be erased. To understand the true cause of Iran's resolve is to understand that it is not just a country reacting to aggression, it is a civilization that remembers who it is. And when the heart chooses to stand, no external force can easily make it fall. When we speak of Iran's resistance, we must resist the temptation to reduce it to political calculation or government propaganda. What we're witnessing is not just a state reacting to threats. It's a nation acting from the marrow of its identity. Iran's resolve is deeply rooted in a cultural consciousness that has been shaped by centuries of resistance, self-preservation, and spiritual depth. To understand this endurance, you have to understand that the average Iranian doesn't see defiance as an event. It is part of a historical rhythm, a pattern of rising from every attempt at subjugation with more resolve, not less. Iran's geopolitical stance cannot be fully understood without first understanding the psychological architecture that holds it up. You see, when resistance is born out of trauma alone, it eventually exhausts itself. But when it is born out of identity, when it is part of who a people believe they are, it becomes generational. It becomes embodied. And that is exactly what has happened in Iran. The resistance is no longer just a political posture. It is cultural DNA. This idea of identity-driven resistance is deeply philosophical. At its core is the belief that to lose dignity is worse than to lose comfort, that preserving one's cultural and spiritual integrity, even at great cost, is more valuable than yielding for temporary relief. This is something the Western political mindset often miscalculates. In cultures shaped by liberal individualism, hardship is often seen as a sign of dysfunction. But in Iran and in much of the global South, hardship is more often interpreted as the price of authenticity. The Iranian psyche has been shaped by this dynamic. Over centuries of invasions, from the Greeks to the Arabs to the Mongols to colonial powers, the people have had to ask themselves again and again, what does it mean to remain ourselves, even when the world is trying to reshape us? This is why symbolism matters so deeply in Iranian society. A martyr's grave is not just a resting place, it is a message. A woman's chador is not just cloth, it is resistance wrapped in tradition. A family choosing to stay and rebuild after war, sanctions, or natural disaster isn't just surviving, they are making a declaration. That declaration is this: we may be pressured, but we will not be erased. And that's not just poetic language, it's a sociological reality. When identity is under threat, communities tend to either dissolve or intensify. Iran chose the latter. Cultural traditions became more than customs, they became lines of defense. Religion became more than belief, it became an anchor of coherence. Even art and literature, especially Persian poetry, function not merely as entertainment, but as tools of memory. When Hafez or Fairs are quoted, it's not just nostalgia, it's a retrieval of ancient resolve. It's the use of language to remind the soul who it really is. But let's take this deeper. From a psychological perspective, identity is one of the most stabilizing forces a person or a people can possess. When someone knows who they are, they become less vulnerable to manipulation, less reactive to fear, and more consistent under pressure. This is why resistance rooted in identity is so hard to defeat. It doesn't depend on immediate outcomes. It doesn't unravel when plans fail. It can survive uncertainty because it is grounded not in external validation, but in internal conviction. That is Iran's position in the global narrative. It has been threatened, sanctioned, isolated, demonized, and yet it stands. Not because it is perfect, not because its leadership is always wise, but because its people carry a memory that transcends politics. That memory tells them we have seen worse, we have endured more, and we are still here. This is not mere nationalism, it is civilizational consciousness. In truth, this is why foreign attempts to reshape Iran often fail, because they misunderstand what holds the country together. It's not just oil or military or policy, it's identity. And identity, once solidified by time, sacrifice, and story, does not melt under pressure. If anything, it hardens. So when the world looks at Iran and asks, why don't they fold? The answer lies not in news headlines or political speeches. The answer lies in the soul of the people, in their memories of empire and exile, of glory and grief, of resistance and rebirth. This is a people who know what it means to survive and still recognize themselves in the mirror afterward. That, more than any weapon or strategy, is the true cause of their resolve. And so the lesson is simple yet profound. Identity is power, and when a heart chooses to stand not out of rebellion, but out of remembrance, what force on earth can truly make it kneel? To understand Iran's endurance, you cannot ignore the role of faith, not just as religion, but as worldview, as emotional architecture, as a daily internal compass. The heart of Iran's resolve is not only political or historical, it is deeply spiritual, and not in the simplistic sense that the country is religious. That's too shallow a reading. What I'm speaking of is a spiritual psychology, a way of interpreting suffering, resistance, and destiny that gives even pain a sacred meaning. In Iran, faith is not an escape from hardship. It is a framework that transforms hardship into purpose. This spiritual backbone runs especially deep in the veins of Shia Islam, the dominant tradition in Iran. Shiism is, at its core, a theology of endurance. It teaches that to suffer for what is right is not a sign of divine absence. It is often the very proof of divine favor. The story of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who was martyred at Karbala for refusing to bow to a corrupt power, is not just a religious narrative. It is an existential template. For many Iranians, Hussein is not simply a historical figure, he is a mirror of the soul. His stance is their stance. His sacrifice is their inheritance. His refusal to surrender, even when faced with certain death, becomes the blueprint for what it means to live with dignity in a world that often demands compromise. This is why spiritual conviction in Iran doesn't collapse under external pressure, it absorbs it. It reinterprets sanction, isolation, even military threats through the lens of spiritual trial. It says, if we are suffering, then perhaps we are being refined. If we are targeted, perhaps we are standing where it matters most. This kind of perspective is difficult for many in the secular world to understand, where suffering is seen primarily as a problem to be solved or avoided. But in Iran's spiritual consciousness, suffering is sometimes seen as a calling to be honored. And that belief has massive psychological implications. It means that hardship doesn't just bruise the national psyche, it strengthens it. In the absence of external reward, the Iranian people often reach inward and upward for meaning. They do not require constant validation from the international community because they derive their validation from a higher court. That is the power of a faith that functions as identity. It provides coherence in confusion, strength in silence, and confidence in chaos. This is not to say that every Iranian is religious in the same way. Faith expresses itself on a spectrum, some through ritual, others through poetry, some through prayer, others through action. But the undercurrent remains. There is an emotional literacy within Iranian culture that is shaped by spiritual reflection. It's why you can walk into a home with almost nothing materially, and yet be offered hospitality with immense pride. It's why martyrdom posters hang in alleyways like family portraits, because faith turns loss into legacy. Even in the midst of political divisions or economic despair, this spiritual resolve keeps many anchored. It prevents despair from metastasizing into hopelessness. Instead of asking, why is this happening to us, many ask, what are we being called to endure? That shift in questioning, however subtle, is monumental, because it means that suffering is not the end of the story, it's part of the unfolding plot. And that belief gives people the psychological endurance to withstand what might otherwise crush them. This spiritual framing is also what makes Iran's posture difficult to dislodge with force. When a people believe that their suffering has meaning, they become very difficult to manipulate. They don't crumble under pressure. They become quieter, more focused. They dig deeper. And when resistance is spiritual, it is not easily exhausted, because it doesn't depend on whether today's situation improves. It depends on an eternal sense of justice, that God is watching, that wrong will be made right, that standing firm will not be in vain. There's also a philosophical dimension here that can't be ignored. In many secular paradigms, resilience is about willpower. But in Iran's spiritual context, resilience is not just about self, it's about submission. Not passive submission to oppression, but active submission to divine timing, to divine wisdom. It's the belief that to kneel before God is what gives you the strength to stand before men. That kind of submission doesn't weaken a person, it steadies them, it aligns them, and from that alignment comes a quiet, unshakable strength. So if you ask why Iran continues to stand, why, after decades of economic warfare, political isolation, and internal struggle, it has not collapsed, the answer is not just strategic, it is spiritual. It's found in the tearful rhythms of Muharram processions, in the whispered prayers of mothers, in the patient waiting of those who believe that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. This kind of resolve doesn't just survive, it transcends. It endures, not because it avoids suffering, but because it transforms it. And that is why Iran continues to stand, not just as a nation, but as a soul that refuses to be broken. When faith becomes framework, suffering becomes sacred, and a people rooted in the eternal will never be easily moved by the temporary. If you really want to understand why Iran has such deep resilience, you have to look at the way memory functions, not just personal memory, but collective memory, generational memory. You see, nations aren't held together just by policies or even ideologies. What binds people over time is shared pain, shared experience, shared struggle. And Iran is a country that remembers. It remembers through ritual, through mourning, through poetry, through storytelling. These aren't nostalgic practices. They are systems of emotional cohesion. They're the psychological glue that keeps people united, even when everything else seems to be falling apart. The Iran-Iraq War, for example, wasn't just a conflict fought in the 1980s. It is still present in the lives of millions, not only in those who fought, but in the children who grew up on rationed food, in families who buried sons, in entire cities that were flattened and then rebuilt by the same hands that once held rifles. These memories are not buried, they are preserved, often honored. They have become part of the national consciousness. You'll find them in murals on the sides of buildings, in songs on the radio, in Friday sermons, in the names of streets. Iran doesn't erase its trauma, it integrates it, and that makes its memory stronger, not weaker. This is why attempts to externally pressure or intimidate the Iranian people often fail, because you're not speaking to a blank slate. You're dealing with a population whose emotional memory is calibrated to survive pressure. They have already lived through what many would consider the worst: chemical attacks, mass funerals, international abandonment. They remember what it's like to be isolated, and because they've been there before, they don't fear returning to that space as much as outsiders expect. The collective memory gives them psychological immunity against many forms of coercion. And this memory doesn't just act as a shield, it also acts as a map. It tells them what to expect, how to react, what stories to draw strength from. It teaches them that survival is possible, that rebuilding is possible, that loss, while painful, is not the end. When you've walked through fire and emerged, scarred, yes, but standing, you begin to see struggle differently. You stop running from it. You brace for it. And that readiness, that emotional preparedness is what makes Iran so difficult to destabilize. Now here's where the philosophical weight comes in. Collective memory doesn't just shape how people feel, it shapes how they interpret the world. It becomes part of their moral vision. In Iran's case, there's a powerful theme of historical betrayal, of standing alone, of being abandoned by allies, of being misunderstood. And while that might sound negative, it actually produces a kind of internal loyalty that is hard to break. When a nation has internalized the lesson that no one will defend it but itself, it learns to become emotionally self-sufficient. It stops expecting the world to be fair and starts learning how to be faithful. That kind of mindset doesn't breed paranoia, it breeds resilience. There's also a deep connection between memory and identity. When people remember their past with clarity and depth, they're less likely to be manipulated in the present. And that's precisely the case in Iran. Even the younger generation, which may not have directly lived through the war or the revolution, still inherits the emotional weight of those moments. It's in the stories their grandparents tell. It's in the cultural rituals they observe. It's in the sense of continuity that permeates their understanding of where they come from and what they're called to endure. This inheritance of memory becomes a quiet form of strength, an unspoken sense that we've been through worse and we're still here. Psychologically, this is what gives Iran an edge, because where many societies forget quickly, moving from one crisis to the next, numbing themselves with distraction, Iran trains itself to remember. And memory builds depth. It builds roots. And roots, unlike leaves or branches, don't snap in the storm. They hold. They anchor. That's why this kind of memory isn't just historical, it's strategic. It teaches the population how to interpret today's headlines through yesterday's sacrifices. Sanctions aren't just economic, they echo earlier injustices. Threats aren't just diplomatic, they recall earlier battles. The past isn't just prologue, it's power. And a nation that knows how to carry its past forward is a nation that will not collapse easily. We often think of memory as passive, but in Iran it is active. It is shaped, it is carried, it is passed down intentionally. It doesn't just linger in the background, it leads. And it teaches an entire generation how to endure, not just because of what they know, but because of what they remember. So when you see a people who continue to stand despite pressure, who continue to resist when it would be easier to surrender, understand this. They are not standing alone in that moment. They are standing with every memory behind them, with every name that never came home, with every city that rebuilt itself, with every prayer whispered under the weight of mourning. That kind of memory is not weakness, it is momentum. And the truth is, a nation that remembers who it is cannot be easily broken by what it faces. One of the most misunderstood qualities of Iran's long-term endurance is its relationship with time. While much of the modern world moves in short bursts of urgency, campaign cycles, quarterly earnings, breaking headlines, Iran, as both a civilization and a state, tends to think in centuries, not in seasons. There is a calm, strategic patience embedded in the way it responds to external pressure and internal hardship. To the outside observer, this can appear slow, even passive. But to those who understand how deeply embedded long-term thinking is in the Armenian psyche, it reveals a different kind of strength, one built not on speed, but on staying power. This is not accidental. It's the product of both cultural history and theological worldview. Persian civilization is one of the oldest continuous cultures in the world. From the days of Cyrus the Great to the Safavid Empire to the modern Islamic Republic, Iran has lived through cycles of glory, collapse, rebirth, and renewal. And in that cycle, it has learned something that many modern powers have forgotten, that empires come and go, but those who endure, who adapt, and who wait often outlast the storm. Patience in this context is not passivity, it is strategic restraint. It's the understanding that not every attack requires a response, that not every insult deserves a reaction. It's knowing that sometimes strength lies in waiting for your opponent to exhaust themselves, and that waiting doesn't mean weakness. It means you have time on your side. This cultural orientation toward endurance is reinforced by religious doctrine as well. In Shia Islam, there is a profound emphasis on divine timing, the concept of awaiting justice, of enduring oppression with the belief that truth will ultimately prevail, is not just tolerated, it is honored. There is even a messianic dimension to this worldview, in the belief in the return of the Mahdi, the promised Savior, who will bring about ultimate justice. This eschatological vision trains the faithful not to expect immediate results, but to live faithfully in the waiting. From a psychological standpoint, this long-term lens rewires the nervous system. It creates a form of resilience that is far less susceptible to panic. While Western systems often rely on acceleration to create dominance, economic pressure, rapid military responses, social disruption, Iran's approach is frequently more absorptive. It takes the blow, absorbs the cost, and recalibrates. It bleeds slowly but rarely collapses. It's not immune to harm, but it's incredibly difficult to destabilize entirely. That's because it's not trying to win in the conventional short-term sense. It's trying to endure. And that endurance extends not just to state policy, but to everyday life. Walk the streets of Tehran, Shiraz, or Isfahan, and you'll meet people who are frustrated, yes, who criticize the system, who wish for change, but who still continue, who raise children, pursue education, run businesses, celebrate weddings. The rhythm of life continues not because everything is perfect, but because there's an embedded understanding that endurance is resistance, that to keep living well under pressure is itself a kind of defiance. This mindset is also what makes external efforts to force change through speed, whether military or economic, so ineffective, because those tactics rely on shock, on disruption. But a society trained to absorb hardship and outlast crises doesn't break the way others might. It slows down, it retreats inward, and then it rebuilds. Philosophically, this speaks to a much deeper truth about power. The most enduring form of power is not the one that strikes hardest, it's the one that stays longest. Iran's strategic patience is an expression of civilizational confidence. It doesn't need to win every battle to believe it will win the war. And that belief is what gives it the strength to remain steady, even in moments of extreme pressure. This also influences diplomacy. Iran often negotiates slowly, carefully, sometimes infuriatingly so to Western powers. But again, that slowness is not inefficiency, it's calculation. It's an understanding that when you're playing a long game, you don't make concessions for short-term relief. You anchor yourself in your vision of the future, and you let others exhaust themselves trying to rush you. There's something deeply countercultural about this kind of endurance in our modern hyperspeed world. But maybe that's exactly why it matters so much. Because in a time when many people and many nations are addicted to immediacy, Iran's insistence on long-term resilience offers an uncomfortable mirror. It shows us what it looks like when a people choose not to run faster, but to root deeper. And that ultimately is the insight worth sitting with. True strength is not always loud, it doesn't always strike first. Sometimes true strength is the ability to stand, absorb, wait, and remain unshaken until the tide turns. Iran's story teaches us that when you align your endurance with your identity and your patience with your purpose, time itself becomes your ally. Because in the end, it's not about how fast you rise, It's about how long you can stand. So when we step back and look at Iran, not through the headlines, but through the deeper architecture of its spirit, we begin to see that its endurance is not accidental. It is cultivated. It is remembered. It is chosen. Iran stands not because it has avoided hardship, but because it has learned to transform hardship into identity. Its people are not fueled by temporary outrage, but by something more enduring. Historical consciousness, spiritual resolve, emotional inheritance, and an unwavering patience rooted in both theology and experience. This is a nation that remembers who it is. And that memory is not just intellectual, it is emotional, spiritual, and embodied. It shows up in the way people mourn, the way they celebrate, the way they sacrifice, and the way they endure. It's not about perfection, no country is. It's about coherence. It's about a people whose inner life has not been broken by external pressure, and that, more than any weapon or policy, is what makes them formidable. So whether you agree with Iran's politics or not, whether you admire or oppose its global stance, you cannot deny its psychological strength. A strength that comes not from force alone, but from memory, from faith, from pain endured without surrender. It is not just a resistance of the body, it is a resistance of the soul. In a world that rewards speed, Iran teaches the power of stillness. In a culture that worships reaction, it models the discipline of restraint. And in an era that fears suffering, it reclaims suffering as a sacred path. The lesson is clear: when the heart chooses to stand, not out of rage, but out of remembrance, it cannot be easily moved, and neither can the nation it beats within.